Hey, this is Dr. Allen. Today we're going to talk about the cell membrane's structure. Now, as we do that, we're going to first touch on the role of ATP in cell metabolism because it's tied into the structure of the cell membrane. And as we do it, we're going to talk about things like the phospholipid bilayer, glycoproteins, receptors, transport molecules, and those sorts of things. Okay, this is a review slide from a previous lesson. This is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We have this adenosine here. We have three phosphate groups, and between these phosphates here, these are considered high energy bonds. This is the formula where the hydrolysis of ATP can release this phosphate group here, leave you with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then a burst of energy. So digging into that just a little bit more, there's this process called phosphorylation. And you can tell that based on the first part of this word, has to do with the phosphate group. So phosphorylation is the process where a phosphate is added to an organic compound. In that previous formula we talked about here, this guy right here is a phosphate group. The little I stands for inorganic, so technically it's inorganic phosphate. But we'll just say phosphate just to make it a little bit easier as we're going through this discussion. So we have this phosphate here. And so this is an example here of some sort of transport work. We're going to go into a little bit more in the next lesson about this, but so imagine this here is the cell membrane, this phospholipid bilayer. There is a protein here kind of lodged in that membrane. There's this stuff here that's on the outside of the cell. There's this same stuff here on the inside of the cell as well. Okay, so when you need to get this stuff here that's in the cell, you want to push it out of the cell. Sometimes you need to have this little transport protein to do that. The point of this diagram here is to say that ATP is used in this process. And in order for that to work, what ATP does is it'll take that phosphate, that PI, it'll attach it here to this membrane protein. It'll phosphorylate this membrane protein. Okay. And then that creates the ability for this protein to do the work of opening up by releasing that phosphate group here. Okay, so it's when this phosphate is released from something, generates energy, it generates a particular change in the structure of that protein in order for it to work and to pump the solute out of the cell. Okay, so moving on beyond ATP. So we're going to talk ATP in bits and pieces over the next few weeks. So that was your little taste of ATP for today, the concept of phosphorylation. Now let's talk about the phospholipid bilayer. As you recall, the phospholipid is a macromolecule. It has this balloon shape where you have the head here. This is the phosphate head. This phosphate head is hydrophilic, meaning that it likes water. The tails are more of the lipid. So the lipids, if you recall, are hydrophobic. They don't like water, so they'll kind of aggregate to each other. So the heads will be facing the fluid, right? Whether it's fluid inside of the cell or fluid outside of the cell, and it'll create this this inner layer of lipids, which makes it very difficult for things that are water soluble to pass through it. And that might make sense here in just a minute. This is taken from Focus Figure 3.1 from your text. Now, this just kind of has a representation of the cell membrane. This is just kind of a zoom in look here. Here's that phospholipid bilayer. And here's some cholesterol, some proteins, and some carbohydrates. We'll get into a little bit more detail here over the next couple of slides. So first, lipids. Now, the cell membrane is more than just the phospholipid bilayer. So again, this is that picture of the phospholipid, that little balloon-like thing with the two strings coming down. But the other type of lipid that's important with the cell membrane is cholesterol. So previously we talked about how cholesterol is necessary for life. Now, too much cholesterol can do things like, cause damage to your arteries, give you heart disease, lead to stroke, and that sort of stuff. But a certain amount of cholesterol is necessary for you to survive. So this cholesterol here, remember that's the little structure of a cholesterol molecule. What it does is it stiffens the membrane, reduces the water solubility. It helps keep things out of the cell that are supposed to stay out of the cell, keep things inside of the cell that are still supposed to stay inside of the cell. And that's the idea of adding that cholesterol to that phospholipid bilayer. And that's represented by these little tiny orange-like little squiggly things in there. Next up are cell membrane proteins. Now remember, proteins are composed of amino acids. It's kind of the basic building block of much of what your body is. But as far as the cell goes, or the cell membrane, I should say, um, these membrane proteins have various functions, and we'll go over them one by one briefly over the next few slides. So one of the first things that it does is it assists with transport. Now, before I had talked about because of this phospholipid bilayer, it creates this membrane that many things cannot normally pass through, right? See these little red dots here? They're outside of the cell. They need to get into the cell, but because of this phospholipid bilayer, it's not able to pass through on its own. So it may rely on these proteins, these little doorways, if you will, passageways to get into the cell. So on this one right here on the left, this is just a basic channel. And so just these particular particles can just pass through this channel without any problems. Doesn't require any energy. It'll just pass through via what's called a concentration gradient. This is the other one we had talked about earlier, this transport molecule. In order for that particle to exit the cell, it may require a certain amount of energy, and that energy is in the form of ATP. By phosphorylating that protein, it activates it and allows that particle to go whoop, right on out of the cell. Proteins can also be receptors for signal transduction. In other words, here's your cell. There has this little receptor protein right here. And so if there's a certain messenger, say a hormone, or some other substance that fits like this little lock and key mechanism, it'll go in here, activate that protein, and when it does that, it causes a change in shape of that protein, and it causes a signaling cascade inside the cell in order for the cell to do a particular activity. Perhaps that messenger may come in and it might signal the cell to make a certain type of protein that the body needs, as an example. Another thing that membrane proteins can be are enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that help a reaction move along at a faster rate and perhaps maybe using less energy. So in this case, these membrane proteins, take this green dot, it'll change it to this orange triangle, which will then go over here and change into this blue square, which is a signaling cascade inside of a cell for the cell to perform a certain function. This is just kind of a generic thing we're talking about here. Next up, we have membrane proteins that act in cell-to-cell recognition. And so here in this particular example, we have this cell that has a glycoprotein. A glycoprotein is basically a protein here lodged in the membrane. It has these little sugars attached to it, glycoprotein. And so another cell, which would be this guy up here, has a certain protein on it as well that would recognize this shape, this particular shape. And by doing so, it allows this cell up here to recognize this cell down here as having some sort of a function, or maybe just being, maybe it's like an identification that that this particular cell knows that this particular cell does a particular job, for example. So it has to do with recognition of a cell from other cells. This next one here, this protein here, is a element of the cytoskeleton. That's the frame inside of the cell that helps to hold it into shape. Okay, and there's also substances on the outside of the cell called the extracellular matrix. It's just substances that kind of the cell resides in. Okay, and so this particular protein here attaches to the cytoskeleton on the inside, but it might also attach to the stuff here on the outside in this extracellular matrix. That helps to hold things in place, maybe act like an anchor. Next, we have cell-to-cell joining. CAMs, cell adhesion molecules, CAM, right? So you have two cells, and you have this protein here in the cell membrane. They can join together, and that can link the two cells through this cell adhesion molecule. Okay, so those are just kind of some general functions of proteins when it comes to the cell membrane. Next are carbohydrates. Now, I had mentioned in a previous slide about something called a glycoprotein. A glycoprotein basically is, if you take the word apart, we have, notice these all have the same thing, glyco, and glyco. Well, glyco just means sugar, like glucose almost. And so we have a glycoprotein, so it's a sugar attached to a protein. We have a glycolipid, which is a sugar attached to a lipid. And then we have something called the glycocalyx. The glycocalyx, you kind of see the definition down here. It's all of these carbohydrates here that are kind of here on the outside of the cell. It creates a coating on the outside of the cell. That sugary coating, if you will, is called a glycocalyx. Here is a example of some sugars that might be linked together, short chains of monosaccharides. Each one of these little green dots would be a monosaccharide, and as they're joined together, and they can kind of make this particular shape. And the shape of these molecules then determine the function of the molecules for what they do. Remember in the previous example, these sugar or these glycoproteins served as recognition, if you will, for recognition markers for other cells. But anyway, so we have glycoproteins and glycolipids. Here in this diagram here, we have this protein here with some sugar attached to it. And then you could also have, you can see in this example here, follow this line up here, you can see that there is some sugar attached to a lipid molecule, glycolipid. Okay, that concludes our discussion on the cell membrane. I encourage you to read through the book as well. It goes into a little more detail and probably explains a little bit more about some of the nuances of the differences in these cellular membrane structures. We'll see you at the next lesson.